Welcome everybody to part 2 of Learn the Entire Torah in 1 hour, but not really. No, really, this is part 2, but we're just going to touch on the themes of each book. So let me just do a very quick summary of part 1, which is online. It's on YouTube. So we discussed last week that we tend to think of the Torah as broken up into chapters, which were invented by Christians, or more commonly by parshas. This week is Parshas Bereishis, next week is Parshas Noach, or last week was Bereishis, this week, whatever. But the parsha system that we use now was a minhag that was developed in Babylonia, in Bavel, 1,000 years after we received the Torah. The only natural breaks in the Torah are paragraphs, which actually are called parshas, but that's different from our parshas, or the books, the 5 books. I'm going to try to do a share screen, and here we go. This is, hold on one second. Now I'm going to share screen. Here we go. All right. And this is just from last week, actually, just a review of last week. So this is an example in the Torah of what I talk about as paragraphs. That's the only kind of break that there is in the Torah, except for the break that is between the books. And here's an example of breaking up between Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Bamidbar. So the point is those are the only breaks, and yet when we discuss the Torah and what it means, we almost never think of it as books. But that's how Hashem gave it to us. So last week we discussed this, and through textual analysis, we came up with the following statement. The statement was that Sefer Bereishis essentially answers one main question, and that is, how did we get from Adam being chosen, the whole world being chosen to receive God's teachings, to Yaakov being chosen, and then the Jewish people being chosen? How did it happen that Hashem went from all of humanity to a small band, a chosen nation? And that is the theme of the book of Bereishis. And as we know, Bereishis ends with that 10th section that's on the handout. Let me bring it up. Let's see here. That 10th Eila Toldos Yaakov, which is the last 14 chapters of the book, and it ends with 70 people going into Mitzrayim. And Sefer Shemos starts off with Eila Shmos B'nai Yisrael, which is these are the names of the 70 people that are now in Mitzrayim. So we've now completed the tradition from all of humanity to a single nation. So for the rest of the Torah, we're going to be talking about this single nation. All right, so let's look at, I'll blow this up a little bit. Sefer Shemos is actually, on one level, extremely simple. There's only 5 things that happen in it. That's it. And as you can see here, so we have the Exodus, which we all know backwards and forwards, thanks to the Seder and the Haggadah, which includes also the journey to Mount Sinai. Then we have the second thing that happens is we got the Torah at Mount Sinai, including all the mitzvahs that are in the next parsha, Parsha Mishpatim, which have 50, 60, 70 mitzvahs in it. Then the command to build the Mishkan. Then the Jews mess up royally with the Chet Egel, the sin of the golden calf. And then the last part is that we get to build the Mishkan anyway, despite the fact that we messed up big time. So if Bereishis answers the question of how did we go from all of humanity to just the Jewish people being chosen, Then Shemos answers the question of what is the identity of that nation. And let's look at what stands right in the middle of Sefer Shemos, the book of Exodus, is Mount Sinai. And it's interesting, if you look at the first commandment, right, Anochi Hashem, it doesn't say merely just I am God. It says I am God who took you out of Mitzrayim. So the Sefer HaGeula, we talked about last week that Sefer Shemos is also referred to Sefer HaGeula, which is the story, the book of the Exodus, essentially, the redemption. And we see that reflected in the first commandment of the 10 commandments. And then Hashem is telling us that I want you to continue the experience of standing at Har Sinai. It's not enough that I spoke to you at Sinai, but I want a place to be among you, to dwell within you, and that's the Mishkan. And so the whole second half of the book is the building of the Mishkan, the instructions for the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan. And it is a perpetual Har Sinai, so to speak. It's where Hashem's presence continues to live among the Jewish people. And actually, we have a lot of halachas and minhagim today that relate to that are comparable. What's the word I'm looking for? An imitation, so to speak. That's the wrong word. Of a recreation. That's the word I'm looking for. A recreation of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So, for example, some people stand during the reading of the Torah. The whole Torah, Kriyas Torah on Shabbos is supposed to be a little bit of a recreation of Har Sinai. And then we have the Chet, the sin of the golden calf, where we mess up big time. We break the covenant. And after the Chet, Moshe pleads with Hashem for forgiveness. And how does he plead? He essentially says, you cannot have a relationship with the people if it's strictly according to justice. So Hashem agrees. We get the 13 midos. So now we're in a refined relationship that's based on mercy. And then Sefer Shemos ends the way it's supposed to, with Hashem dwelling with us in the Mishkan, even though we are imperfect. A perfect ending to this whole explanation that we are a people. So Shemos answers the second question. The first question is how is it that a nation was born? But the second Sefer, the second question is who are they? What is their identity? I should say, who are we? What is our identity and what is our relationship with Hashem? And it's in two parts, a two-part answer. Our relationship is partly one of listening to the commandments, and it's also partially of mercy. And so, and that concludes Sefer Shemos with one little twist. And I want to show you on my screen here. And this is awesome. This is the key to 3 of the books all at once. Let's look at the very end of Sefer Shemos. So I'm just going to quickly summarize the English here. We're going to look at the last 6 verses. So they set up the enclosure on the Mishkan, put an altar and a screen, When Moshe finished the work, the cloud covered the Mishkan, and the presence of Hashem filled the Mishkan. Moshe could not enter the Ohel Moed because the cloud had settled upon it and the presence of Hashem filled the Mishkan. So what should be next? What should be after that? Right? The summary is we have a Mishkan, but Moshe can't go in because the cloud's there. So what should be next? What should be next, obviously, is the cloud lifted and Hashem invited Moshe in. And in fact, if you look at the first pasuk of Leviticus, of Vayikra, that's exactly what it says, right? Vayikra el Moshe, right? Hashem called to Moshe and spoke to him saying, and then you have the whole rest of the book. The weird thing is that that's not the end of Sefer Shemos. There's 3 more verses that seem totally superfluous and out of place, right? And we all should know by now, whenever anybody teaching Torah says these verses seem superfluous. That means obviously they're not superfluous, right? So these are the last three verses of Sefer Shemos. When the cloud lifted, Bnei Yisrael would set out on their journeys, but if it didn't lift, they wouldn't set out. So what is this describing here? Because over the Mishkan, the cloud of glory was on there, and a fire would appear by night. This is describing how they traveled through the desert, but we're not doing that yet. So what I want to say is that this is sort of a double cliffhanger. This is describing, these last three verses are describing Sefer Bamidbar that travels through the desert, right? Let's quickly review here. So in the last 6 verses, the first 3 lead into Vayikra, and then the last 3 lead into Bamidbar. So I want to bring you to, we have a double cliffhanger. I want to bring your attention to the right side of this. So the double ending of Sefer Shemos, so one leads to Vayikra and the other leads to Bamidbar. And this is really the key to understanding how all the books fit in together. And here's my proof. This is interesting if you think about it. How do we know that we have the narrative running in parallel? Is that we know this because the dedication of the Mishkan, which is on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is described in 3 different places in the Torah. The same day is described in 3 different places. So first of all, it's described right here, right? The cloud, the Shekhinah descends on the Mishkan. That is the first day that the Mishkan is open for business, right? We also see it in Parshas Shmini, which is in Vayikra in Leviticus. On the 8th day of the congregation, there's the whole big ceremony with Moshe and Aaron. That is also describing the inauguration of the Mishkan, and that is also on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And the third place is in Parshas Naso. That's the Parsha where that mind-numbingly, if I can say such a thing, Parsha where all the Nisim bring the gifts. They bring all the gifts on the first day of the Mishkan. And the exact same language gets repeated 12 times as each prince of each tribe brings all their gifts. And that, so that also is describing the first day that the Mishkan was open for business. So we have here, in terms of plot lines, the ending of Shemos is also the beginning of Vayikra and towards the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, right? So we have the double cliffhanger leading to 2 different books. All right, so what does that tell us? So let's look at the first of the 2 continuations, which is the book of Vayikra. Vayikra is also called, as we know, Torah's Kohanim. So it answers the question of what does it look like for a nation to have a relationship with Hashem in the Mishkan? Sort of. Because if we look at the progression here, and I got this right off of Wikipedia, it was a nice summary here. So we have all the korbanos here. So all the, that's how we interact with Hashem in the Mishkan. We have the korbanos. The institution of the priesthood, fine. We have uncleanliness and its treatment. We're starting to get a little bit off course here. We're learning about Tumah and Tahara. We're learning about kashrus, things that are holy. It sort of relates. It's fine. And then we get to a discussion of Yom Kippur. It's not exactly in the Mishkan, although the service of Yom Kippur is very related to what goes on in the Mishkan. And then we get all these other things, sacrifice, sexual behavior, neighborliness. Chapter 19 here is where we learn you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and all kinds of really awesome mitzvahs. And then we get chapter 23 are all the holidays, and then Shabbos and Shemitah year. What's going on? What's going on here? So what I want to say is that the answer is in chapter 19. So the first half of Vayikra is really related to the Mishkan. How are we relating to Hashem in the Mishkan? And one of the ways we relate to Hashem in the Mishkan is through an interaction of the Kohanim and the priests that are in charge of the Mishkan, the Kohanim and the Leviim. But then this is the key, one of the key pasuk of all of Sefer Vayikra is in chapter 19, which is sort of the dividing line. And chapter 19 says, "You shall be a kingdom of priests for me." The Malaches Kohanim, kingdom of priests for me. What does that mean? How can we all be Kohanim? And that's the question I want to answer right now. There are two sets of Kohanim in the world. Regarding the Jewish people, we have our Kohanim. The priests run the Mishkan, and we all know what that means. But when we get to the pasuk, "You will be a nation to me of priests and be a holy nation," now we're talking not just the story of the Mishkan, it's a story of how the holiness emanates from the Mishkan to sanctify everybody else. In other words, the first half is about the Kohanim. The second half is about all of us and how we are Kohanim to the rest of the world, right? The priests have to attend to somebody. So our priests, the Kohanim, Lee Cohen and his friends, they attend to us, but we as a nation of priests attend to everybody else. So Vayikra, if I could sum up Vayikra in one sentence, it means, what does it mean to be holy in and out of the Mishkan? So it answers another question. When Hashem, this is interesting. When Hashem chose the Jewish people, did Hashem which is what Sefer Bereshis was about, right? We started with all of humanity. We ended up Hashem choosing just the Jewish people. So did Hashem decide to abandon the rest of the world? Or is it that Hashem did not change the goals, he changed the means by which his word would be spread throughout the world? In other words, was his original goal that he wanted everybody to serve him, and then he gave up on that and said, okay, only the Jews do it? Or did he say, I want humanity to serve me. I tried one way and it didn't work, so now I'm going to try a different way. I'm going to choose a single nation and teach them, and they will teach the rest of the world. And Sefer Vayikra is the answer to that question. It's the second answer, obviously. A nation of priests and a holy nation, that pasuk really is the answer to that question. The role of the Kohanim were teachers. We are Kohanim, so we are teachers too. Hashem did not reject the rest of the world. Rather, Hashem changed his methods, but not the goals. He went from directly educating to all of humanity to directly educating us. And our job is to educate humanity. That is Sefer Vayikra in a nutshell. Now let's move to the fourth book. The fourth book, if we remember going up here, right? So you have the double ending of Sefer Shemos. So Vayikra explains how is all about holiness, about how the Kohanim attend to us and that we are a nation of priests and we attend to the rest of the world. Bamidbar is where Bnei Yisrael is traveling through the desert. So what does that mean to us on a broader theme? What that means is, how do we relate to Hashem when we're experiencing the mundane? My favorite example of this is the difference between Yom Kippur and the day after Yom Kippur. It's really easy to be holy on Yom Kippur. We're surrounded by all this pomp and circumstance, so to speak. You know, we're in shul the whole time. We're fasting. We're on an elevated level. I mean, it's easy to feel holy on Yom Kippur. The question is, how easy is it to feel holy the day after Yom Kippur? Can we take the lessons that we've learned in Yom Kippur to the next day, which is obviously a substitute for, or a mashal for taking it throughout the rest of, as carrying it throughout the rest of the year? And that's what Bamidbar is. In Sefer Vayikra, which has Yom Kippur in it, we learn how to relate to Hashem in the Mishkan. Sefer Bamidbar is how do we relate to Hashem when we're doing the mundane things, traveling through the desert, which for us metaphorically means traveling through our lives. So let's take a look quickly at the narratives here. The first 10 chapters of Sefer Bamidbar, it's the organizing of the camp, leaving Har Sinai, pretty mundane, offering the Korban Pesach. Then right at the end of chapter 10, beginning with chapter 11, start all the complaints. And we get like 9 straight chapters of complaints. And the second greatest sin that we did, the sin of the spies, and the punishment we get for that, the incident with Korach. And then, interestingly, then suddenly it skips ahead 38 years. Like nothing happens during those 38 years. And actually, let me change that statement to saying this. Nothing happened during those 38 years except for one thing. People were dying. According to the Midrash, when men who were involved in the sin reached the age of 60, if they reached the age of 60 that year, then on Tisha B'Av of that year, they would die. Rav Soloveitchik suggests that it's too harsh a thing to put into the Torah. So the Torah hints at it in chapter 19 are the laws of Tumas Mace. In other words, the laws of impurity that you get from death. Rav Soloveitchik suggests that that's enough of a hint that the Torah is telling us during these 38 years, nothing much was happening except for the fact that people were dying 38 years. And then chapter 20 and on is where the book jumps ahead. And we are about to learn like how it is to, we're getting ready for the next generation to enter the land of Israel. In fact, Chazal says that Bamidbar is 3 books, not 1 book. So we have the before the big sin, right? The generation that received the Torah, then the big sin of the spies, and then we get the next generation as we're about to enter Eretz Yisrael. So again, the whole book is, how do we react? How do we relate to Hashem when we're on our journeys? And let me just mention one other point, one other question we mentioned last week. We said that another name for Bamidbar was Sefer HaPekudim. Pekudim, you can think of it, in this context, means counting. It's the book of countings. And we asked the question, it's sort of a strange name. Granted, there is a census, there are 2 censuses, but it's not what the whole book is about. Why would you call it that? And now we sort of have our answer. The first census was for the first attempt at leaving Har Sinai and getting to Eretz Yisrael. The Midrash tells us that that whole transverse through the desert was supposed to only take 11 days. So that's how it was supposed to be. The first sentence is what it could have looked like, and then we had another census for what it did look like. The second census was for right before we were about to enter Eretz Yisrael. So really we have sort of 2 bookends that encapsulate the entire theme of the book, and that's why it turns out, not surprisingly, Sefer HaPekudim is a very good name for the book. And then we have finally the 5th book, Sefer Devarim, which, as we know, is pretty much just one really long speech by Moshe. And as I put in the handout here, it's actually 4 speeches by Moshe. But that's, so what's the content of that and what's the theory of that? The secondary name of Sefer Devarim is Mishnah Torah, a repetition of the Torah, except it doesn't repeat the whole Torah. It does repeat a lot. So, that's one reason why it might be called that. On the other hand, don't we learn? I mean, traditional thought is that all the laws are already given at Sinai. So why are you repeating? We learn a whole bunch of new laws here. Right? So on one hand, why are you repeating the old laws? On the other hand, why are you also bringing in new laws when all the laws were taught at Sinai? And the answer is that most of the laws that are in Sefer Devarim, if you look at them, are laws that you need to build a nation. So then you ask the question, so why are we hearing about these laws for the first time? It's a very interesting answer. It's a simple answer if you think about it. It's because, yes, the laws were given at Sinai, but all the people who heard those laws have passed away. So Moshe Rabbeinu through Masorah, through the handing down, we know that the people will have heard all the laws, at least indirectly, but Moshe Rabbeinu wants to stress the new laws, or wants to stress the laws that they will need to enter into Eretz Yisrael. All right, so let's sum everything up here. I'm going to hit stop share. Let's sum everything up. What we have here is the following. So the first book is, the summary is how the Jews got chosen instead of all humanity. The second book is what is our identity? The third book is how do a people forge a relationship with Hashem via ritual, meaning both within the Mishkan, and also how to be a holy nation, as holiness and sanctity emanates from the Mishkan. The fourth book, Sefer Bamidbar, is how the people have a relationship with Hashem as we're doing the mundane acts of our lives, so-called mundane acts of our lives, traveling through our lives, traveling through the desert. And it also talks about how we were supposed to get to Eretz Yisrael and how we ended up getting to Eretz Yisrael. And then the fifth book, Devarim, is how do we build a nation in a land, going from being a nomadic people to a settled people. So this is the divine play in 5 acts. Each book pushes the narrative further. Each book tells us something fundamental, which is, what does it mean to live as a Jew? And what does it mean to live in the world? So I want to repeat an idea that we just mentioned in Vayikra, which is that just as the Kohanim and Levim are teachers of Bnei Yisrael, so too are we supposed to be teachers into the world, right? A light unto the nations. I'm sure we've all heard that expression before. So when Hashem selects us, he's not rejecting the world, he's readjusting his methods. He went from directly educating humanity to choosing a nation who would educate humanity for him or her. And how do we do that? And that's what Sefer Devarim ideally is about. It's building a model nation in Eretz Yisrael. The point here is that we don't just have to understand the books. We should understand the interactions between those books and keep them in mind as we go through the Chumash. So again, I'll just half a sentence summary for each book. Bereshis is how do we act? No, this is actually a different view from Rabbi Yitz Echelon. Looked at the entire Torah in the following way. Bereshis is how we interact with God as human beings, right? Because nobody was a Jew there yet. Shmos was how we interact with God as Jews. Vayikra is how we interact with God as priests and being a holy people. Bamidbar is how we interact with God as tribes and families, as that's how we travel through the desert. And Devarim is how we interact with God as individuals. And that's why we get, for example, Shema Yisrael is in the 5th book, right? And how do Shema Yisrael, what's the message? Love God with all your heart, with all your soul. So now let's put everything together and look at the entire Torah so that we can see that it is indeed, as has been called, a divine play in 5 acts, the unfolding of the Jewish people. So To summarize one last time, Bereshis is how do we go from all of humanity to a nation? Shmos is how do we become a nation of sanctified priests? Vayikra is how do we become a nation, and then we go to a nation of interacting with God in our mundane travels, Bamidbar, and then finally to a nation of nation builders in Devarim. But also how do we interact with Hashem on all 5 levels, as human beings, as Jews, as priests, and through our families and individuals. So what's the point of this whole set of lectures here? Granted, you didn't learn all of the Torah in 1 hour, but we learned an overall view of the entire Torah in 1 hour. So why is that important? And that is when we go through the Torah week by week, parsha by parsha, we may be reading a parsha, but we're also within each book for like 2.5 months. And parsha is not how Hashem revealed the Torah to us. There are 5 themes, 5 messages, 5 ideas. And if we want a complete relationship with Hashem, we really ought to understand 5 levels. And as we look through, as we study each parsha, we should look at it through the prism of these 5 themes. And and we should also look at the transition as we move from one book to another. And if we can do that, it will deepen our understanding of the message that Hashem wants us to get from the Torah, which is to understand how to be servants of Hashem in all its complexity, how to act in the world, and to understand more fully what our most important text is to us is. So thank you very much.